Hello, I'm Celia Hayes, and you're very welcome to my study here in London. And the big question that I want to talk about is, where does metacognition come from? But of course, first, I need to talk a little bit about what metacognition is. Now, in abstract terms, metacognition is our capacity to monitor, control, and regulate ongoing thought. And this is something which is thought to be distinctively human. So non-human animals are capable of what you might describe as implicit metacognition. They can use error signals from one thought process as inputs to another thought process. But explicit metacognition is somewhat different. It is a big user of working memory. It is typically a conscious process, and it's typically verbally reportable. So it is explicit metacognition that enables us to say, I'm sure, and I'm not so sure. So that's what metacognition is in the abstract. But like so many things in psychology, to some degree, it is defined by how it's measured. So how would I measure your metacognitive sensitivity? Well, I would bring you into the lab and I would give you a primary task and a secondary task. The primary task could be a test of perception or memory or judgment. So say it was a test of perception. I might, on each trial in the test, present you with two lines on a computer screen. And your job is to say whether those two lines are parallel or whether one of them is slightly at an angle relative to the other one. So on each trial, you would be presented with the two lines. You would give your answer, are they parallel or diverging? And then the secondary task, you would be asked, how confident are you that you're right about that answer? If it was a memory task, then you might be shown a whole bunch of pictures or of words, and then after seeing that whole bunch, you'd be shown one at a time, one, say, picture at a time, and asked, is that old? Was it in the previous set, or is it new? And crucially, you'd be asked, how confident are you you were right about that? If it was a judgment task, you might be asked a lot of general knowledge questions. Is Damascus the capital of Syria? And again, after answering that primary question, you would give your estimate, typically on a percentage scale, of how confident you are that your answer was right. Now, there are various ways of combining your responses on the primary and the secondary task into an estimate of your metacognitive sensitivity. But the gist of all of them is that we're going to compare how often you express high confidence in correct responses, the ones that actually turned out to be right, and low confidence in incorrect responses. Those, the higher those numbers, the better your metacognitive sensitivity. But then that's offset by how often you express low confidence in correct answers and high confidence in incorrect answers. So combining those numbers, we can get an estimate of your metacognitive sensitivity. And the interesting thing is that an individual's metacognitive sensitivity tends to be consistent across tasks. So if you've got high metacognitive sensitivity on a perceptual task, the chances are it's also high on memory and judgment, but also on your judgments about your own physical abilities. So if you've been conversing and you're asked, how fluently did you speak? Or if you're asked, how good a runner or a swimmer are you? Again, your sensitivity to just how good or not so good you are is likely to correlate with your metacognitive sensitivity on these psychological tasks, perception, memory, and so on. There are marked individual differences in metacognitive sensitivity. So those of us who sometimes feel anxious have good news. Anxious people tend to have high metacognitive sensitivity. We also tend to have low metacognitive bias. Now, what that means is that when asked to rate our confidence, our estimates of confidence always tend to be a bit low. We have a low bias, but the sensitivity means that even within that low range of confidence scores that we're giving, our confidence estimates are well calibrated with how likely we were in fact to be correct. So in the case of anxiety, high metacognitive sensitivity, even though there's a low confidence bias. In the case of people who experience compulsions, compulsions to perform certain actions like hand washing in order to keep difficult thoughts at bay, for example, they often have low metacognitive sensitivity and a relatively high bias. Interestingly, many people have looked for a relationship between general intelligence, as it's measured by IQ, and metacognitive sensitivity. I think a lot of people have the hunch that those two are going to be positively related, but in fact, nobody has found such a relationship. Metacognitive sensitivity is really important in a variety of everyday contexts. When you're making decisions about your education, about employment, and so on. But also, I mean, for example, in the recent pandemic, it's been important for each of us to make decisions about personal risk, risks involved in going to certain places, mixing with certain people, using public transportation, and so on. It's important that we've made those judgments of personal risk, but also that we had a good sense of the likelihood that those judgments were right. That's our metacognitive sensitivity. But also in public life, metacognitive sensitivity is very important in governance and business, in education, and in law. So in business, for example, two heads are better than one in making a decision only when both heads have good metacognitive sensitivity. In education, children with better metacognition benefit more from education. And in law, slightly worryingly, juries are more influenced by the confidence with which a witness expresses their testimony than with the consistency of the testimony, than with whether the parts of their story hang together. Confidence goes a long way in law. So that's what metacognition is and what we use it for. Now the big question, where does it come from? Most specialists working in this area tend to assume that our capacity for metacognition is genetically inherited, that it's like eye color. It's something that we inherit organically from our parents. They acknowledge that experience is needed for the childhood development of metacognition. So, for example, experience in which a child might look at a stick sticking out of a pond and think that it's bent. And then they pull this stick out of the water and they can see that it's straight. So they've had experience in which they had a percept of a bent stick, and their own intervention, their own interaction with the world revealed that that percept was wrong, that the stick isn't bent at all. So most people assume that we genetically inherit a program for the development of metacognition. We need some experience of dealing with the inanimate world, like the stick example, in order for it to develop, but that's the whole story. I think that the evidence suggests that those two factors, genetic inheritance and direct interaction with the world, play a role, but not the dominant role in the development of metacognition. I think the evidence suggests that metacognitive sensitivity is culturally learned. Now, what I mean by that is that it's learned with the guidance of experts. So yes, we need to intervene in the world, like pulling the stick out of the pond, but we also need somebody who already has highly developed metacognitive sensitivity to enable us to interpret our interactions with the world such that our own metacognition develops. Let me say a little more about that, about what it is that we are culturally learning and how our interactions with other people, with experts, enable us to learn those things. Essentially, I'm suggesting that the learning of metacognition is like the learning of literacy, of the ability to read print. Everybody knows that our neural and psychological processes that enable us to read cannot be in our genes, because reading has only been around for 5,000 or 6,000 years. And that's not enough time for genetic evolution to give us special mechanisms for print reading. Instead, we learn to read culturally under the guidance of people who are already expert readers. So that's a model of what I'm suggesting for metacognition. Here's a little more detail. So what I've suggested with some colleagues in a recent paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences is that we have a series of psychological processes that enable us to take in information from the world in the form of various kinds of perception, to make decisions about it, and to formulate courses of action. We have a series of processes that do that, which operate pretty much in the dark. We don't know much about them. We're not consciously aware of how they're operating. But they do give off some kind of amorphous feelings or experiences. As observers or researchers, we might categorize those conscious feelings that arise from unconscious processing as perceptual experiences arising from sensory processes, emotional experiences which relate to action, and metacognitive experiences, sort of like a steam that rises off all of those unconscious processes. One metacognitive feeling is a feeling of fluency, a feeling that processing is going well. Now, as researchers, we can categorize those feelings: perceptual, emotional, metacognitive. But what the evidence suggests is that the child has to learn how to distinguish those feelings one from another. Perceptual from emotional, from motoric, from metacognitive feelings. They need to learn to tell them apart and to learn what their significance is. How do they learn this? Well, let's take an example. So say you have a small child and they see a kind of a grayish brown coiled shape in the grass at their feet. And their unconscious processes categorize this as a snake. And they get a feeling of fear as a consequence of that. But the child's not sure that what she's feeling is fear. She had a feeling like this before when she made a mistake. She thought she saw a bent stick, and in fact it was a straight stick. So she's unsure whether the feeling she's got indicates that it is a snake and it's fear, or whether the feeling she's got is metacognitive and it indicates that her unconscious processes are not doing very well on this stimulus. Now, an adult nearby, a metacognition expert, what they say may disambiguate the feelings for the child. So if the adult says, it's okay to be afraid, step back, then that confirms to the child that the feeling they have is emotional. But if instead the adult says, really? Do you think that's a snake? I would look more closely. I don't think it is. Then that categorizes the feeling that the child has as a metacognitive feeling, and a metacognitive feeling indicating that their judgment is unlikely to be right in this case. So that's the big idea in answer to the big question. Let me just before finishing give you 3 little samples of the evidence in support of this cultural learning of metacognition hypothesis. One is that metacognitive sensitivity is very late developing. Things which are genetically inherited, like color vision, tend to kick in and be operational early in development, whereas metacognitive sensitivity continues to develop right up to the age of 18. So, for example, in a study where the primary task was one in which people had to say, of 2 successive patches of blue, which of them is brighter, the first or the second? And then after making that judgment in each trial, they had to say how sure they were that they'd given the right response. Now, between the ages of 12 and 18, people were equally good at performing the primary task, but their metacognitive sensitivity, the correlation between their confidence judgments and their objective accuracy, went on improving right up to the age of 18. So the development of metacognitive sensitivity goes on until very late. Second little sample, a study, I think this is such a cute study, in which students were given text to read, and the text was about a potential new examination policy. So it was a topic they cared about. And they were given to read this, either black print on a white background, easy to read, or yellow print on a pink background, really difficult to read. So the black on white is likely to have given rise to metacognitive feelings of fluency or ease of processing, whereas the yellow on pink is likely to have given rise to feelings of disfluency or dis-ease of processing. Now, the interesting twist is that before they read the text, these students were primed with one of 2 ideas. Either they were primed with our normal understanding about ease of processing, which is that it's a good sign. So they They were told that, if it feels easy when you're reading the text, that means that, you're understanding it well. Whereas the other group were given a novel piece of cultural learning, the experimenter, a credible figure, told them that a feeling of ease while they were reading about the new examination policy probably indicated that they were thinking in a rather shallow, unreliable way. So those two priming groups read the text, either black on white or yellow on pink. Then they were asked their opinions about the potential new exam policy and asked how confident they were in those opinions. And the people who had been primed with the usual assumption, ease of processing shows good processing, rated their confidence higher when they'd read black on white than when they'd read yellow on pink. But that was reversed by the cultural learning of the experimenter telling people that a feeling of ease of processing is a bad thing, means that your processing is unreliable. In that case, the people who read yellow on pink had more confidence in their judgments than the people who read black on white. And finally, something with perhaps more ecological validity, research on meditation and mindfulness training, cultural practices, a potent source of cultural learning. There are studies showing a very beautiful correlation between how many hours in a lifetime a person has spent meditating and how good their metacognitive sensitivity is in a touch perception task. So that covered people who had spent 1 hour in the course of their whole lives meditating, right up to people who had spent 15,000 hours meditating. And across that range, metacognitive sensitivity in an apparently unrelated task, which of two taps on your hand was heavier, their metacognitive sensitivity increased with their practice of mindfulness and meditation. Of course, that's correlation, and we shouldn't trust correlations all by themselves, but there's also intervention evidence. For example, Koch and Singer did a study in which they randomly assigned people for training in thought observing meditation, which would be expected to improve metacognitive sensitivity, versus body focused mindfulness, which would not be expected to improve metacognitive sensitivity. People were randomly assigned to one of those two training conditions. They received months of training. And as predicted, the thought observing mindfulness training led to a significant enhancement of metacognitive sensitivity. So, big question, where does metacognition come from? The answer, of course, genetic inheritance contributes, and of course, direct experience of the inanimate environment contributes. But the dominant force in the development of metacognitive sensitivity is cultural learning, learning guided by experts, learning very like the learning which enables us to become literate. And what does this imply? Well, it provides further evidence that the cognitive processes that make humans distinctive may be not cognitive instincts, things that we inherit in our genes, but cognitive gadgets, mechanisms that we assemble from old parts that we have in common with other animals in the course of development through social interaction. And on the practical side, it means that metacognition and other human cognitive gadgets may be trainable. At the moment, the cultural learning occurs informally. We barely know that we're doing it. But in principle, we could make learning to be a good metacognizer more like learning to be a good reader. We could formalize the training and help people who have difficulty. Thank you.